The evening had started like any other. Mark came home from work, his shoulders heavy with the weight of another long day. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt oppressive rather than peaceful. He dropped his keys on the counter and glanced at the clock. 7:15 p.m. She wasn't home yet. He wasn't surprised. She had been working late a lot lately, or so she said. He didn't ask questions anymore. He had learned the hard way that asking only led to arguments, to her sharp tone and dismissive words. "Why do you always have to interrogate me? Can't I have a life outside of you?" He sighed and opened the fridge, staring at the contents without really seeing them. He wasn't hungry, not really, but he needed something to do, something to fill the silence. He grabbed a beer and twisted off the cap, the sound echoing in the empty kitchen. As he took a sip, his eyes landed on the calendar hanging on the wall. It was one of those generic ones, the kind with pictures of landscapes that no one really looked at. But today, the date circled in red caught his eye. August 14th, their anniversary. He froze, the bottle halfway to his lips. 8 years. 8 years of marriage, of shared dreams and sacrifices, of late nights and early mornings, of laughter and tears. Or at least, that's what it had been for him. For her, it seemed like just another day. He put the beer down and walked over to the calendar, staring at the circled date as if it might reveal some hidden meaning. But it was just a number, a reminder of something that felt increasingly distant. The sound of the front door opening pulled him out of his thoughts. He turned as she walked in, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. She looked as polished as ever, her hair perfectly styled, her makeup flawless. But there was a coldness in her eyes, a distance that had been growing for months. "Hey," she said, barely glancing at him as she dropped her bag on the couch. "Hey," he replied, his voice flat. He wanted to say more, to ask where she had been, why she hadn't called. But he didn't. He knew how that would go. She walked into the kitchen and opened the fridge, pulling out a bottle of water. "Long day?" she said, more to herself than to him. "Yeah," he said, his eyes still on the calendar. "It's our anniversary." She paused, the bottle halfway to her lips. For a moment, he thought he saw a flicker of something. Guilt, maybe? But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "Oh," she said, taking a sip of water. "I forgot." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He had expected it, but hearing her say it out loud was different. It made it real. "You forgot," he repeated, his voice low. She shrugged, her tone casual, almost dismissive. "It's just a date, Mark. It's not a big deal." "Not a big deal?" he said, his voice rising despite his efforts to keep it steady. 8 years of marriage and it's not a big deal?" She turned to face him, her eyes narrowing. "Here we go again. Another lecture about how I don't appreciate you enough. Get over it, Mark. Don't owe you anything." The words hung in the air between them, sharp and cutting. He felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him. "I don't owe you anything." How could she say that? After everything they had been through, after everything he had done for her, for them. "What does that even mean?" he asked, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and hurt. "What do you mean, you don't owe me anything?" She crossed her arms, her expression cold and unyielding. "It means exactly what it sounds like. I'm tired of you acting like it's some kind of obligation. Just because we're married doesn't mean I owe you anything." He stared at her, his mind racing. He wanted to argue, to tell her how much that hurt, how rejected he felt, but the words wouldn't come out. Instead, he just stood there, staring at her like a stranger had suddenly appeared in his wife's body. The silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Finally, she rolled her eyes and walked past him, her heels clicking against the floor as she headed upstairs. "I'm going to bed," she said, her tone final. "Don't wait up." He stood there for a long time after she left, staring at the empty space where she had been. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions, anger, hurt, confusion, betrayal, but beneath it all was a deep, aching sadness. He had spent years trying to make her happy, trying to be the husband she wanted, and for what? To be told that he didn't matter? That his feelings were irrelevant? He walked over to the couch and sank down. The house was silent again, but this time the silence felt different. It felt like the end of something, like the closing of a chapter he hadn't realized was finished. As he sat there, the words echoed in his mind over and over. "I don't owe you anything." They were like a knife, twisting deeper with each repetition, and with each twist, something inside him hardened, turned cold. He didn't know what he was going to do. Not yet, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let her words define him anymore. If she didn't owe him anything, then maybe he didn't owe her the endless sacrifices he had been making to keep their marriage afloat. The seed of revenge had been planted, and it began to grow. Mark wasn't impulsive. He had always been methodical, deliberate in his actions. If he was going to do something, he would do it right. And so, as the days turned into weeks, he began to formulate a plan. It wasn't something he decided overnight. It was a slow, simmering realization that grew with every dismissive glance, every cold remark, every moment she made him feel invisible. The first step was observation. Mark began to watch her more closely, not as her husband but as a stranger might. He noticed the way she lit up when she talked to Alex, her coworker. They were just friends, she had said, but Mark saw the way her eyes sparkled when Alex cracked a joke, the way she leaned in a little too close when they spoke. It wasn't just friendship. It was admiration, maybe even something more. He also noticed how much she valued her reputation. She prided herself on being the perfect wife, the perfect professional, the perfect friend. To the outside world, their marriage was a fairy tale. She posted carefully curated photos on social media, smiling selfies, romantic dinners, weekend getaways, always with captions that painted a picture of bliss. But Mark knew the truth. He knew the cold silences, the empty promises, the way she could make him feel like an afterthought with just a look. One evening, as he sat alone in the living room, scrolling through her Instagram feed, an idea began to take shape. If her reputation was so important to her, then that was where he would strike. He wouldn't confront her directly. That would be too easy, too predictable. Instead, he would dismantle the image she had worked so hard to build, piece by piece, until there was nothing left. Mark began by withdrawing emotionally. He stopped asking about her day, stopped making an effort to spend time with her. At first, she didn't seem to notice. She was too wrapped up in her own world, too focused on her career and her social life to pay attention to his silence. But as the days turned into weeks, he could see the cracks beginning to form. She would throw out little comments, testing the waters. "You've been quiet lately," she said one evening, her tone casual but her eyes sharp. "Everything okay?" He shrugged, keeping his expression neutral. "Just tired," he replied, his voice flat. "Work's been busy." She studied him for a moment, as if trying to decide whether to press further, but then she shrugged too, turning back to her phone. "Okay," she said, her tone dismissive. "Just let me know if you need anything." With her guard down, Mark began to subtly manipulate her relationships. He started with her friends, making offhand comments about how they seemed to be excluding her from their plans. "Did you see Sarah's post from last night?" he asked one morning, his tone casual. "Looks like they had a great time. Shame you weren't invited." She frowned, her brow furrowing as she picked up her phone. "What are you talking about?" she asked, scrolling through her feed. "I wasn't even aware they were hanging out." Mark shrugged, feigning indifference. "Maybe they just forgot to invite you," he said. "Or maybe they didn't think you'd be interested." He could see the doubt creeping into her expression, the way her lips pressed into a thin line. "That's ridiculous," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "They're my friends. They wouldn't do that." Mark didn't argue. He just nodded, letting the seed of doubt take root. Next, he moved on to her co-workers. He began to suggest that Alex might have ulterior motives. "He seems pretty friendly with you," he said one evening, his tone light but his words carefully chosen. "Almost too friendly, don't you think?" She rolled her eyes, but he could see the flicker of uncertainty in her expression. "Don't be ridiculous," she said. "Alex is just a friend. He's not like that." Mark raised an eyebrow, his expression skeptical. "If you say so," he said, his tone implying otherwise. As the weeks went by, Mark's plan began to take shape. He started to plant evidence, small, seemingly insignificant things that could be easily dismissed but would add up over time. He created fake emails and text messages, carefully crafting them to look like they had come from Alex. He made sure they were vague enough to be deniable but suggestive enough to raise eyebrows. He also began to spread rumors at her workplace, dropping hints about an affair between her and Alex. He didn't do it directly. Instead, he used anonymous accounts and third parties to ensure his involvement couldn't be traced. The rumors were subtle at first, just whispers in the break room, but they grew louder with each passing day. The days after Mark's calculated betrayal were a blur of tension and silence. The house, once a place of shared memories, now felt like a battlefield, each room heavy with unspoken words and unresolved anger. Mark had achieved what he set out to do. His wife's world was crumbling around her. But as he watched her struggle, he began to feel a strange emptiness. Revenge, it seemed, was not as satisfying as he had imagined. She had always been so composed, so in control, but now she was unraveling. Mark saw it in the way she moved through the house, her steps hesitant, her eyes darting nervously as if expecting another blow. She had lost her job, her friends, and even her family seemed distant. The rumors Mark had spread had done their work too well. One evening she confronted him, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and desperation. Did you do this? She asked, her eyes searching his face for answers. Did you spread those rumors? Did you ruin my life? Mark looked at her, his expression calm, almost indifferent. Do what? He replied, his tone cool. You're the one who said you don't owe me anything. Maybe this is just the consequence of your choices. Her face flushed with anger, but there was something else there too. Fear. You're twisting this, she snapped. I never said I didn't care about you. I just wanted space. Then show it, Mark shot back, his voice sharp. Because right now, all I see is someone who wants the benefits of a marriage without having to put in the work. The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Instead, she sank onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. I don't know how we got here, she whispered. Mark didn't respond. He just stood there, watching her, feeling a strange mix of satisfaction and emptiness. He had wanted her to hurt, to feel the pain she had inflicted on him, but now that she was broken, he realized it didn't make him feel any better. If anything, it made him feel worse. The distance between them grew with each passing day. They moved through the house like strangers, avoiding each other except for the occasional brush pass in the kitchen or hallway. She tried a few times to restart the conversation, to bridge the gap between them, but Mark shut her down every time. He wasn't ready to talk, not yet. Instead, he spent that time figuring out what he wanted. He thought about whether he could keep living this way, trapped in a marriage that felt more like a contract than a relationship. He thought about the years he had poured into them and whether any of it still mattered. But most of all, he thought about himself. About who he had become in this marriage and who he wanted to be moving forward. One evening, after another day of silence, Mark walked into the living room and found her sitting there with her phone in her hands, pretending not to notice him. But he could tell by the way her shoulders tensed that she was waiting for him to finally say something. He didn't waste time dancing around it. I can't do this anymore, he said, his voice steady. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide. What do you mean? She asked, her voice trembling. This, Mark repeated, motioning between them. I can't keep pretending like we're fine when we're not. I can't keep giving and giving while you act like it's enough just to be here. She started to speak, but he cut her off. I'm not angry anymore, he told her. I'm not even hurt. I'm just done. I don't know if that means we separate, if it means counseling, or if it means something else entirely, but I know I can't keep living like this. For the first time in weeks, she looked genuinely scared. So, you're leaving? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark shrugged. Maybe not, but I think we need to spend some time apart to figure that out. Her eyes filled with tears, and for a split second, Mark almost caved. He almost wrapped his arms around her and told her they'd figure it out like they always did. But then he remembered her words, that she didn't owe him intimacy, and the fire that had been keeping him going reignited. This isn't just about you, he said, his voice firm. You made it clear what you don't owe me. Now I'm making it clear what I won't keep giving without something in return. He grabbed a bag he had already packed and walked toward the door. She didn't try to stop him. She just sat there, crying quietly, while he stepped outside and shut the door behind him. As Mark drove away, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Relief. Not because it was over, but because for the first time, it finally felt like he had a choice. The first few days apart felt strange, almost like he was living someone else's life. He had dinner alone, sat in silence without a TV buzzing in the background, and went to bed without hearing her footsteps down the hall. At first, it was liberating, but then the loneliness started creeping in. Not because he missed her, but because he missed the idea of what they used to be. She called him on the third night. He almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of him. Hey, she said, her voice small and hesitant. Hey, Mark replied, his tone neutral. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Finally, she broke the silence. I don't know what to do, she admitted, her voice trembling. I don't know how to fix this, Mark sighed. I don't either, he said, but I know I can't keep living like we were. In the end, the decision wasn't as dramatic as he thought it would be. There was no explosive argument or tearful goodbye. It was just a quiet understanding that they had grown too far apart to ever find their way back. Mark filed for separation a month later. She didn't fight it. And even though it hurt to close that chapter of his life, he walked away knowing that he had finally chosen himself, something he hadn't done in years. As Mark sat alone in his new apartment, staring at the blank walls, he felt a strange sense of peace. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was in control of his own life. He had spent years pouring into a relationship that had stopped pouring anything back, and while the scars of that experience would always be a part of him, he knew that he had made the right choice. He had chosen himself, and that was enough.